I was standing in Israel on Har Menuchas, the place where the mother and her two daughters were being laid to rest. And as the ambulances were coming in to bring them there was quite a large crowd. The father looked to me, and this is 10 o'clock at night, and he said to me, "Rabbi, why does God allow for these things to happen?" What am I going to answer him? I have something to say to him? I don't have an answer, and it would be presumptuous arrogance to even attempt to answer. I just walked over to him and I gave him a big hug and I held on to him while he cried and I cried.
Welcome to Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. I'm Chana Weisberg, host of this podcast. Joining me today, we have a very special guest. His name is Rabbi Schochet. He is the rabbi of Mill Hill Synagogue in England. He's an international lecturer, and he also happens to be my first cousin. Thank you so much for joining us, Rabbi Schochet.
That's my claim to fame. They have to start with the cousin.
Right, of course. Of course. Yeah. So many people have always asked me over the years if we're related. And sometimes I say yes and sometimes no. I'm joking. Okay. So, you are the longest serving rabbi in the United Synagogue system, which is a long time. You've been in the rabbi of Mill Hill for how many years?
Been Rabbi Mill Hill for 31 years, and prior to that, I was in a smaller United Synagogue, also under the same umbrella, for about 2.5 years. So it's 33, heading to 34 years this August.
Wow. How does it feel?
It's amazing how when I first came in and I used to look at these older rabbis that had been in the system for so long and think to myself, goodness, not me, but here we are.
Here we
In
are.
fact, I had a very close friend, also Chabad, who was a rabbi here for a while. And we used to look at these older rabbis, not to be intending to be disparaging. We used to say, remind me when we get there that we should never become like that. But again, here we are.
Right. So is this something that you always thought you would be?
A United Synagogue rabbi, actually a pulpit rabbi, not
Or
necessarily.
both? What is it that United Synagogue Rabbi is, for those of us that don't really understand the
The
difference?
uniqueness of a United Synagogue rabbi, I guess you might say that in America, if you're going to be a rabbi, a pulpit rabbi of an Orthodox synagogue, then by definition, you are in a strictly Orthodox synagogue. United
Mm.
synagogues, to all intent and purposes, are almost like glorified Chabad houses in that you are in a synagogal structure. I would say that in my membership of about 1,800 or so
Oh, wow.
families, the overwhelming majority are of various observance levels. Sure, I have about 100 or so Shomer Shabbos, but many others that, yes, kosher, not kosher, or whatever else besides. So in that sense, you're doing exactly the same style Chabad house type work with the community in
Mm.
a broader sense.
Hmm. So it must be, juggling quite a bit of different principles. How do you balance, keeping people involved while still keeping strong to your principles? For example, something like female engagement. How would you take care of that?
In the main, obviously, again, you would apply the same principles as you would in any instance as a Chabad rabbi. I don't think that the challenges that I face are specific or unique, unlike what you might otherwise encounter in a Chabad house, with the only difference being that obviously when you come into a Chabad house, you are the rabbi, it's your Chabad house, you call all the shots. When you are in a United Synagogue, or in other words, or in a mainstream synagogue of sorts, then you are somewhat at the mercy of the membership and you can't ignore the cries or demands of a membership that might be looking for whatever sort of change. Um, in the main, I have managed to balance that very well over the many years, thank God. But interesting that you brought up specifically about women because that has become a single biggest challenge in the last number of years. I don't think it's unique, again, to the United Synagogue that Jewish women in general are clamoring for more say, more voice, more presence. I think it's fair to say that that exists to one extent or another within Chabad as well. And I know that from various different conversations and encounters, albeit that in the broader world of Chabad, everybody knows their limits. And as much as they might feel frustrated, they know that sometimes there's an element of Kabbalah soul having to accept that this is the way it is and I will carry on nonetheless. I can't get away with that in the same sort of way in my circumstances. So I have to find always some element of appeasement whilst again still staying true to principles. So there are certain no-go areas for me, and there are certain areas of flexibility. No-go areas would mean that I mean, we as a synagogue never had bat mitzvahs on a Shabbos morning. A lot of United synagogues had for many, many years. We kind of were the last bastion. We held out the longest in that respect. Today we do, but it's not in the main service. We would never do that. That is to say, in the middle of the service. It would happen at the end of the service. So you finish a Dan Olam, and if the girl then wants to come in and do her Devar Torah, davening is over, then so be it.
Mm.
Um, that's kind of the acceptable norm endorsed by the London Best Inn. And I should stress that the London Beth Din is essentially the de facto halachic authority of United Synagogues. But they leave a lot of gray area, which creates tension because, some shuls do certain things, other shuls don't. And then why can't you? Such and such a shul does, etc. So, for example, we have, of course, a prayer for the royal family. Um,
Mm.
some shuls, I guess, in America do a prayer for the president. And we have a prayer, of course, for Israel. And in as much as we've stretched ourselves as far as we can go in terms of accommodating women within the realm of halacha in this service, there are certain no-go areas or certain categorical rulings. And again, we have a unique advantage in being able to fall back on the London Beth Din for a broad range of things. And there are certain gray areas, and then I will have to exercise my own discretion in that regard. Don't
Hmm.
forget,
Interesting.
our structures in our shows are very different. We have ladies' galleries. That is the single most discriminatory setup insofar as women are concerned in any shul. Um, so many Chabad houses, mainstream shuls in America, all have side by side, and women
Right.
therefore feel automatically more engaged. We have galleries, which means that the ladies are either way up on the sides, or in our case, we don't even, the structure doesn't even allow for that. They're just way up at the back. Um,
Hmm.
my dream currently, as a final step of accommodating women as best as I could, is to restructure the entire interior of the main sanctuary to allow for women to be sitting side by side and thereby feel more engaged, more involved to whatever extent.
Yeah, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, you brought up Chabad. I know shluchos say, well, the whole power is in the shlucha, not the rabbi.
So true.
So
Yeah.
for sure. So it's the women who have the power there. But what, like, yeah, I would imagine that that would be something that women would enjoy much, much better than in England.
When I recently flagged it and I mentioned it in a number of different settings, women are excited about the prospect, and now it's just a matter of making it happen.
Right, absolutely. So I mean, I jump started a little ahead to that because you mentioned different, different levels of observance in your community. But first of all, tell us how you got to be a rabbi in a pulpit synagogue in England. How did it all come about?
I am a victim of circumstance. I married an
Mhm.
English girl,
Okay.
an only daughter, so
Okay.
it was almost inevitable. That said, and you talk about the power of the shlucha, I never had any intention. I learned here. I studied here in yeshiva, 1986. It was an incredible year of learning, incredible. But dealing with the mentality, oh my goodness, that was like whoa. 1987, I am in 770 Eastern Parkway, and it is an evening right after the whole case of the Sfarim, the whole Dida Nutsach saga was won with the whole book court case that happened. And there was a big Farbrengen. There were a lot of people singing, dancing, and a lot of lachaims. And that was a single most therapeutic moment when I was just airing about the English mentality and what we called klipas anglia. Um, and I suddenly found myself surrounded by a whole bunch of English boys. And it's kind of like, you're standing there airing about a certain ethnicity and you're surrounded by that ethnicity. You have one of two choices. You either back down or you go for the biggest guy. I didn't back down. I doubled down and I kept going. And then one guy came wagging his finger at my face. These guys were also, after a few L'chaims, but taking serious exception to what I was saying about the English mentality. And he said to me, oh, you'll see, you'll end up there one day. And I still remember this. Well, I didn't remember it for a long time, but I said to him, and I quote, I swear to you, I will never marry there. I will never end up there. Now,
Oh, wow.
I will have forgotten that. I will have forgotten that, but for the fact that he reminded me of it about a week before my wedding, because 2.5 years later, he turned out to be my brother-in-law.
Oh,
Um, My father made the
Amazing.
point when he heard that story that I'm living in sin because I never properly annulled that vow, but that's besides
I
the
hope you
point.
did since then, yeah.
So
Oh, wow.
here I
Never
am.
say never.
Never
Wow.
say never. Be careful what you wish for, right? Um,
What do you mean by the English mentality? What was it that you didn't like or that you got used to since then?
well, let me just pick up on your final
Or
point.
have become it?
No, no. I always said the day I get used to the English mentality is the day that I have to leave, because
Oh,
that means
wow.
I become one of them. And my edge has always been with that North American mentality. Everybody knows in the United States and Canada, anywhere else besides, the English are always a little bit slow in coming forward. They're more relaxed. Just everything is the word England in Yiddish is Engeland, which is very narrow. There's a certain narrow mindset, narrow mentality that encapsulates most of, well, all of England and much of Anglo Jewry. Yes, maybe they become a little bit broad-minded in the general sense, but that's what we always struggled with when we were studying here as a group of 10 North Americans in the United Kingdom.
Mm.
But even so, yeah, so I ended up
So now
marrying.
that we've insulted all of our English viewers, keep
Yeah,
going.
I never intended to. I married English, but never intended to move here. That's certainly not.
Did you
Um,
find your wife had that mentality?
she was open when we went out before we got married. She was certainly open to all prospects, but deep
Mm,
down, obviously, she had her own ideas of what she would have wanted. There was actually another offer that had come up, um, to come to the UK at a certain point in time, and I was perplexed about it. Didn't know what to do. And my wife was keen, obviously, because it meant coming back home to be with her parents. And I wrote to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe gave me a unique answer. The Rebbe answered me by saying, "Ka'atzas hayrov shiachyu," following the
mm,
advice, followed the advice of my parents. And then
mm,
Oscar Aletzia, and I'll mention it by the gravesite of the Frierdiker Rebbe, etc. So I went and discussed it with my father, who I guess for one reason or another did not want to assume responsibility and told me that I should go ask Rabbi Heller.
mm,
So I went to Rabbi Heller and I said to Rabbi Heller in Yiddish, but I'll just translate. I said, Rabbi Heller, the Rebbe told me to ask you about whether or not I should go to England. At that point, it was a community called Luton. And he said, the Rebbe told you that you should ask me. I said, well, actually, the Rebbe told me that I should ask my father. And my father told me that I should ask you. So to
mm,
all intent and purposes, the Rebbe told me to ask you. And I'll never forget, he sat there for a moment. And I have to say this in Yiddish because otherwise it'll lose the nuance and then translate. He said, Luton, Luton, Mistama das Gora verkrochene englische Städtel. Besser als nicht. He said, Luton is probably a real narrow, tiny little English village. Probably better not. Now, this is a man who understood Europe, came from Switzerland, and essentially encapsulated English mentality, verkrochen, like just a real, And he told me better not to go to Luton, and that was it. We didn't go to Luton. But a year later, and I was already finished studying in Kallel under Rabbi Heller, another option came up, this time for a place called Richmond. And I didn't take the call on this one, my wife did. And I
mm,
remember exactly where I was when she called me and she said that so and so had called, Rabbi Vogel, who was one of the head shluchim here in the UK, Olav Shalom, and he called about the prospect of you going to Richmond. And I was in the middle of something, and I said, "Okay, I hear. I'll get around later to discuss with my father." And she said, "Don't bother. This time I called him before I called you." That's the power of a shluchah.
exactly.
Okay. And that was it. From there, obviously, we went to Richmond. We were there for 2.5 years. It was with the consent of I mean, we went on the condition that I would be a pulpit rabbi, but also officially recognized as a shliach under the auspices of Chabad UK, with a contract from them as well. And then when after about 2.5 years, there were a whole bunch of changes of events that were happening, with the prospect of another Chabad rabbi coming into Richmond and Mill Hill then opening up. And the same Rabbi Feivish Vogel was very keen to get Chabad into Mill Hill.
Mm,
In his choice English words, which I also still remember, it's a plum community. Don't ask me what
mm,
that means. I still don't know, but it implies whatever it implies. So we wrote to the Rebbe then as well, myself and the other Chabad rabbi who was then going to take over in Richmond. And about 2.5 weeks later, 3 weeks later, we got the answer to make the change. That said, I was up against 30 something other candidates at the time.
mm.
The answer wasn't immediately forthcoming. A lot of rabbis, and there was a placement committee at the time who had say about which rabbis should go to which communities together with the chief rabbi. A lot of rabbis were opposed to Chabad taking on Mill Hill, and
Mhm.
they aired their concerns. And it was actually the same day as that meeting took place with those rabbis that the bracha from the Rebbe came through, when the then chief rabbi Jonathan Sachs told all those rabbis, I hear what you're all saying, but I overrule, and I think Rabbi Schochet is the
Mm.
right one for that community. And 31 years later, here we are.
Wow, incredible. And how does it feel 31 years later?
Thank God, it's good. It's going from strength to strength. It's still going solid. When you are riding the waves with the Rebbe's bracha, you keep going, and the brachas keep manifesting. And as long as one stays focused, things will keep on growing and achieving. I
Well,
have to admit, I had one wobble since we're talking about it. It was 2001. I had taken quite ill with a serious chronic stomach condition. And at the time, I had just taken out a life insurance policy. And the life insurance policy also included what is termed permanent disability, which means if you can't any longer function, you can leave to a smaller shul and do less, and they'll pay out, and that would be that. But it also means almost essential semi-retirement. And then I was what?
mhm,
I mean, if I'm turning 60 this year, I don't know, do the math. So I was probably just
mm,
edging whatever. And I discussed with my father at the time, and wasn't sure, back and forth. I still remember it went through all the necessary channels in the insurance company, and it went to the ombudsman. That's the man who makes the decision at the top. And that morning, when that decision was going to come through, I went to the mikveh and I wrote a pun, and I decided to open up an Igros to read and to learn and to prepare myself for what would be a life changing experience. And the letter that was on that page was a letter from the Rebbe to somebody who had written to him about his parents, saying that they are struggling physically in their shlichus because they are not as well, and maybe the Rebbe can encourage them to ease up a little bit more, etc., etc. And the Rebbe's answer was, if you think that by decreasing in their spirituality that will somehow enhance their physicality, then you're making a fundamental mistake. On the contrary, the more
mm,
they put effort into their shlichus, into their spirituality, that will enhance their physicality, their physical health as well, because the two are interdependent. And I remember picking up the phone. I remember calling the insurance broker, and he's like, "Hey, Rabbi, today's the day." And I said, "Freddie, you have to call it off." And he's like,
wow.
"What?" He says, I said, "Freddie, you have to call it off." And he's like, "Why are you, what?" I said, "Just, I can't explain. You won't understand. You need to call it off." And that was it. I can tell you that I struggled with that condition for a while, but in 2019, when I went back to my specialist for what was then only a checkup every 4 or 5 years, he then said to me, if I didn't know that you had it, I would not now know that you have it.
Wow. Hmm.
So thank God for
Incredible.
that.
Wow, that's amazing.
So we
Really
stay
amazing.
focused and we stay engaged and we keep doing what we need to do.
For decades and decades and
Thank
decades.
God.
And so what are some of the secrets from the pulpit that you've learned, about people, about your community, about what it's like to be a rabbi, about what ticks people or what ticks them off?
Huh. That's an interesting question. I've made no doubt several, excuse me, several mistakes along the way. I've had some difficult interactions along the way. If there's one thing I have learned is that there's been a tremendous shift in general mindset. Yes, people enjoy intellect, and people will always enjoy a great sermon from the pulpit that keeps them engaged and inspired. And it's incredibly challenging to do that week on week for 30 plus years. But people also love heart, and now more so
Mhm,
than ever. And you can achieve as much with an individual through a hug as you can through and even more so than through an engaging and a dynamic sermon. Yes, I know I've changed people's lives through sometimes simple things that I might have said. I years ago gave a speech, and
mm,
the theme was about the ends justify the means. Hallow the means is a pagan concept. It's not a Jewish concept. Robin Hood is not a Jewish role model, and I just brought
mm,
that out in the context of whatever it was at the time. And I got a phone call from a guy afterwards after Shabbos. So are you telling me that if I want to come to Shul, I'm better off not driving to Shul and that's therefore staying
Mm,
home? I said, how you come to Shul is none of my business. You come to Shul, I'll hug you the same way and I greet you the same way as anyone else. But if you're asking me whether you should drive to Shul or otherwise not come to Shul, I will tell you that you're better off and God will appreciate your prayers more so from at home. And ever
mm,
since then till present, he walks the 2 miles or 2.5 miles
mm.
to Shul every Shabbos.
Wow,
But but at the end of the day, today people prefer the warmth and the hug much more so.
for sure. And
Um,
and how do you
go
do
on.
that with 1,800 people, though?
It's not easy, and they're not all in shul on a regular basis. But there are different ways and means by which you need to make sure you turn up when they are there for to be there for their simchas, when they're there for their crises. You can't afford to be lazy. You can't afford to say this one I'm going to give a miss.
Mm,
There was that sadly famous, tragic story that happened only several weeks ago, just before Pesach, of the mother and her two daughters that were killed in New York in the
right.
car accident. She was a daughter who grew up here in Mill Hill. Her parents are members of mine. Um, Laziness would have dictated. Of course, we immediately went down around to their house. I sat with them. We cried together. We chatted together, etc., etc. They left the next day to the funeral.
Mhm,
Laziness would have dictated and was dictating
mm,
that, wait till they come back. But my wife's encouragement, get on a plane, go to Israel,
mhm,
be there with them for that
mm,
funeral. They will never forget that. And that's
mm,
what I did.
right.
It's all those kinds of gestures, sometimes small, sometimes big, but in the other people's eyes, always looming large.
Wow, that's very interesting. So I know the Jewish Telegraph called you the most influential rabbi of our times in the sense that you influence a lot of people. How do you feel you have influenced people?
The Telegraph called me one of the 10 most influential rabbis of the UK,
Oh,
not
the
necessarily of
UK.
our times. The
Right.
Jewish Chronicle, you could take that for what it's worth, called me one of the most outspoken rabbis in the world. That's a
Well, I'm
separate
gonna get
issue.
to
We'll get
that.
to
Yeah,
that.
I'm gonna get to that.
Look, I never had any media experience in any way, shape, or form. I once, actually, as I was looking to leave Richmond and come to Mill Hill, went to meet with then Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And because I was the last person in his office, when I left, he had just taken, or his office had just taken a phone call about whether they would send a rabbi onto the BBC Radio 4 to talk about marketing.
Mm,
So they were going to have the head of Oxfam, which is a huge national, maybe international charity, and they wanted a rabbi to talk about marketing religion. And because I was the last person he saw, I was the first person that came to mind. So he suggested my name. I took a phone call from his office to ask if I would be willing to go straight to the BBC studios
mm,
and jump on air and have this interview. Of course, I'm nervous because I've never had the. When you get near there, call me. That was the then chief rabbi's chief executive, Jonathan Kestenbaum, today Lord Kestenbaum, and I called him, and he said, "I can only give you one tip, and this is the sum total of my media experience." He said to me, "You don't always have to answer the question. Just
mm,
say what you want to say. Stay focused, pay attention to the question, but just say what you want to say. Make sure your message gets across. Don't get sucked into their conversation if that's the direction in which if they want to take you
mhm,
in a particular direction." Anyway, so that was it. I went in there. It was a 45-minute interview, and very flatteringly, Jonathan Sachs was addressing the United Synagogue Council the following week and said something along the lines of "A Star Is Born." I
mhm,
only got to hear about it after some other people. I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to that accolade, but nevertheless, it was a fun experience, and it was the first of many, 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 many media experiences since, including a regular slot on the BBC Any Questions dealing with morals, ethics, and whatever.
mhm,
Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman, which is a high profile, it's whatever, all that. So when you're engaged in that kind of media profile, and then also my own column in some of the Jewish press, you can influence in whichever sort of way.
mhm, and
Sometimes it riled people. Sometimes I would be
mhm,
controversial. Not everybody would be happy with many of the things I might have said along the way, even though I would
mhm.
argue that it might have taken a few years before I was subsequently vindicated. But
Mhm.
Nevertheless, case in point, when National Holocaust Day was first launched here in the UK, I was actually outspoken against it.
Mhm.
And that raised the ire of so many people here because, what are you crazy? There's now an opportunity. National Holocaust Day. My argument was number one, there's already a Yom HaShoah for those who mark it and commemorate it. And let's put more emphasis on that. Why do we want to start nationalizing our Holocaust Day? And if anything, is going to be perceived as pushing our agenda on wider society. And that
Mhm.
in turn will result in other people then denigrating the Holocaust, which will then just bring the whole thing into ill repute. It'll be very, very counterproductive. The end result of that was, and you want to talk about influence, I get a phone call from the chief rabbi's office. How could you? How dare you? The chief rabbi apparently took a phone call from the government, from the home office, saying, we thought that all of your rabbis subscribe to this ideal. Here you have a rabbi who wrote a piece in the London Times and another piece in the Daily Mail, big pieces, arguing against it. So he called me in, the chief rabbi. And interestingly enough, I bet you he knew where I was coming from and didn't necessarily disagree because he didn't tell me off. He actually was at
Mhm.
pains to explain to me why there is going to be a National Holocaust Day,
Mhm.
explaining that because he had tried for Holocaust legislation against Holocaust denial, but that the government couldn't implement. This was the compromise position.
I
Fast
see.
forward to 2 months ago, and we
Mhm.
had a visiting rabbi here he used to be here in the UK, and he is currently the rabbi of Lincoln Square Synagogue in New York, Shaul Robinson. And he got up at my pulpit because I invited him to speak. He was here for the Shabbos. And he began by saying, just paying whatever compliments, and then saying along the lines of, I've come to learn that Rabbi Schochet is most often right.
Ah.
And he went on to say, when Rabbi
What
Shochet came out,
vindication.
well, I completely forgot about the story at the time, but he brought up all those years
Mhm.
ago the National Holocaust Day saga of this is almost 2 decades ago. And he says, I was furious. Why would he say that? He goes, today, I can tell you, he was 100% right because look what happened. Everybody's denigrating the Holocaust. Everybody uses the day to protest against Jews, etc.,
Mhm.
etc. So we gained
Mhm.
nothing.
Wow, very interesting. And I know you mentioned that you're also called the most controversial rabbi, and were there other issues? What were one of your most controversial issues that you've dealt with?
I was outspoken against legislation for legalizing marriages between same-sex marriages. If people want to live their lifestyles, whether I do or don't agree with them, it's one thing. But when you start trying to mainstream that in society by recognizing it nationally, legalizing it, et cetera, I had a very big problem with that, and I was particularly outspoken against that. Um, I don't know. There was just a broad range of different
Mhm.
things I'd have to go back on when there was a whole group of people that said Kaddish for terror. This is Jewish people who said Kaddish for terrorists. There was a group of terrorists. I
Mhm.
can't remember the specifics that were killed by Israel long before October 7th, a good number of years beforehand. And there were a group of people that got together, some from here in the UK, that actually said Kaddish for the dead terrorists.
Mhm.
Um, there was variations of outcry. I was particularly outspoken with my choice language. That may not have gone down well. I defended it. Um, I didn't use. I would never call a fellow Jew a capo. I think that's wrong. But to refer to a mentality as capoism, I don't have a problem with, and that's what I
Mhm.
described it as. People don't make that distinction, so of course there was all kinds of backlash to the terminology, et cetera, et cetera. I'm very
Mhm.
specific and I'm very particular about my choice language, but a lot of the time people don't make the distinctions. I guess I need to be more mindful of that, as my wife always tells me.
Right. Well, as you get older, do you find that you're more careful with the controversial issues, that you're not so outspoken? Have you become more moderate, or have you become more extreme in your views or more
Um,
outspoken in your views? Let's put it
so
that way.
a lot of people who know me said, say, I haven't seen you in the media as much. Um,
Mm.
you're going soft, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say I haven't become less controversial. As I've become older, learned a lot more to listen to my wife and therefore not say the things that she tells me not to say.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's cool. Wise wife. Always listen to the wife.
Absolutely.
Um, that's very interesting. So, you mentioned your father before, and your father, Rabbi Emanuel Shochet, was a brilliant, brilliant man, scholar, mystic, writer, author, lecturer. I mean, brilliant, known by so many. What was it like to grow up in his home?
Challenging, if I'm going to be honest. Challenging
I'm
because
sure.
he was very demanding. Um, and challenging because I had to share him with much of the Jewish world.
Mm,
So I didn't always have his undivided attention, um, as much as I might have craved it, but didn't necessarily demonstrate that I crave it. I just knew that that's just the way it is. And I invariably grew up in his shadow. If I'm going to be very honest, somewhere in the back of my mind, it was always the case that I knew I'd have to fly somewhere further away or as far away from Canada as possible if I wanted to
mm,
spread my own wings, if only because I was always, till today, I still get to hear, that I am Rabbi Emanuel Shachet's son. And I take great pride in that. Um, in fact, I grew up obviously in Toronto, as did you. And I had call it the luxury of wherever I went. I was either, until today, I'm either Rabbi David Shochet, your late father's nephew, or I'm Rabbi Emmanuel
mhm.
Shochet's son, or I'm Rabbi Ezra Shochet, the Roche's nephew. So wherever you go, you're always defined by a great family, effectively, either your great father or your great uncles. Um, and
I
again,
remember my father once telling me that someone asked him if he was Chana Weisberg's father, and he said it with such pride. It was like it was so cute, like, how he was asking, and he says, "And I was so proud of you then." But,
uh,
yeah, it's very hard, I'm sure, for you. You were also the oldest son. Did you feel a lot of pressure to live up to his image, live up to what he was?
I have no doubt. You asked me earlier if I always intended to go into the rabbinate. Um, in part, in the first instance, definitely not. Psychology was a strong passion of mine. Completely separate to that, marketing was a very different passion of mine. Turns out that I'm in a position where I end up doing both.
Mhm,
But there was an unquestionable pressure because all I got to hear all the time was 2 centuries of rabbis, right? We date back,
mm,
going all the way back through our fathers and then our grandmother and grandfather, 2 centuries. It's quite a long chain. So there was almost this implied indication that I, need to make sure that I continue the chain. I have a letter somewhere here in my room where my father wrote to me when I became rabbi here in Mill Hill. A beautiful letter in which he gives me all of his blessings and in which he emphasizes you're carrying on the legacy of more than two
mm,
centuries. So that was always there in the background. And I guess I feel good that I did right by my father because deep down I know he always wanted that legacy to be continued.
hmm. But did you feel like you were stepping into shoes that were so big? Like, and how did you handle that feeling, that intimidating feeling?
Yeah, no question about it. I always knew that I had to recreate myself. I couldn't
Mhm,
be my father. The sort of things that he did and his breadth and depth of knowledge was, as you say, quite exceptional. So I needed to recreate myself in my own way, doing my own thing. And here we are again.
I'm sure he'd be proud, yes, 100%.
It was
Uh,
interesting you say that. Now, I don't know. I mean, let's just, if we're doing this, we can lay our cards
Go
out on
ahead,
the table.
go ahead.
Shachets were never very good at compliments, at least at my end anyway. They're just,
Oh, my father was good at that. He was
okay.
he was such a
They're very
sweetheart.
funny enough. I used to get a lot of compliments from your father, and I called him many
Yeah,
times from the UK to discuss different issues. And he always then took a personal interest in asking me about everything that was going on over here, and sometimes politically, Jewish wise, et cetera. And he always paid me a compliment, which always
yeah.
felt particularly good. So maybe it was
And it
unique
it
to
was
my
not
father.
like a just a compliment, it was like a sincere compliment, like, he didn't just say compliments like people say, "Oh, you're so da da da." Like, his compliment was it was a compliment, but it was also really sincere. Yes.
100%. So
Yeah,
I don't know if it was unique to my father, part of his demanding nature, but
right,
it meant that much more, I guess, all those many years later. Of course, he always gave me the praises as you are as a kid, well done, this, that,
right.
and the other. But it was so many years later into the rabbinate where he would, if he had opportunity. I remember when I started with JLI,
Mhm.
2010.
Jewish
Um,
Learning Institute
yes, Jewish
for
Learning
Chabad.
Institute for Chabad, and there was the National Jewish Retreat, and he was unable to go because he had just then taken ill. And true to his style, you want to talk about compliments. When I was getting ready to go, and I was with him visiting down at Toronto before going, he said, "Well, if you do a good job, great, and if not, you can chuck it up to experience." I'm thinking, "Okay,
Oh, that's
thanks
cool.
for the confidence." But thank God it went exceptionally well. And I wrote to him, and he must have heard as well. And he wrote me that email that I still have saying, "Yeah, Schochet's rule. Well done. I'm so proud of you." And those
Wow.
words, "I'm so proud of you." Wow. And then again, after that, another lecture I gave, which he was in attendance at. So in the later years, the praises were forthcoming and well meant, reflecting, I would honestly say, in hindsight, that they were always there too, albeit maybe never
Mhm.
overtly expressed.
Right.
So that's
Wow.
what it was like growing up with my father.
With him. Wow.
Yeah.
Did I'm surprised he was actually in attendance at your lecture. That must have been quite intimidating.
It was a celebration in Toronto for 50 years of my parents.
Oh, okay, I
So
remember
I
that,
spoke.
yes.
He had nowhere to go. He
Yes.
had to listen.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
and again, he didn't comment at the time, but he sent me an email when I came back to the UK saying, "I don't know if I got around to saying this to you, but I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I watched it again on the video, and it was full of teichen, it was full of substance, and it was well delivered, and I'm very proud, etc., etc."
That's
So yeah.
beautiful. That's really nice. Did we just spoke about you being very controversial. Did your father help with you to give you courage? Did he give you that courage to be controversial? I mean, you're very outspoken in your views. How did you get that courage to be so outspoken and so courageous against the whole tide?
So that I definitely took from him. I will have seen him do that many a time on whatever the sort of issues. Obviously, he for many years was very outspoken on Jews for Jay, cult busting, public lectures where he would go head to head with people, etc. So I watched that. I lived that on so many levels. I've heard him debate so many times. So you develop that sort of confidence that as long as you are strong in your convictions, then by all means, what do you have to fear to express them? Even if
Well,
there's going to
I
be a
guess it
backlash.
takes this. I guess it takes a certain self-esteem, a certain courageousness to do that because you could be hated by a lot of people by doing that. A lot
This
of
is
people
true.
have a lot of difficulty standing up to the crowd. How do you manage to stand up so strong and be hated as a result by some?
I guess you have to roll with those punches. It's a fair question, and it's an interesting point of discussion that I have with my wife because she doesn't want me to be spoken badly of in other people's mouths. Um, but I guess I don't really care what other people think about me if I am standing up for my principles. If they think about me badly because I'm not a nice guy or I was rude, fair enough, 100%. But if they think about me badly because I was outspoken on a particular issue, and I was some years ago outspoken on a women's issue. This is going back many, many years. At the time, as a result of which one woman went storming out, encountered my wife, and just unleashed on her, which of course upset her a lot. So I felt
Mhm,
bad that I put her in that position. And I was definitely in this lady's bad books for a very, very long time, as I'm sure I am in other people's. But if it's because of my principles, I'd rather just stand for my principles. Otherwise, what's the point? What am I
mm.
about? So what, to stay
So
quiet altogether? Well, if it comes my way, then I am expected to say something. And to say something that isn't in truth with my own essence, there's no point.
mm. What would you advise others who are having difficulty with that, with staying true to themselves while because of the opinions of others?
I will quote Jonathan Sachs again when I was sitting with a group of rabbis in a small working group, and it was like a closed session for people to air their concerns. He was amazing with the rabbinate and allowed for them to air their concerns, their anxieties, and to give them a guidance. And I remember one rabbi saying about how there were two people who sat in the front row of his synagogue every single Shabbos, muttering and saying things, obviously disagreeing with whatever he was saying, obviously took a dislike to him and all that. He goes, and I've tried everything, reaching out to them, engage them. They just don't want to know. It's been going on already for a number of years. What do I do? And I'll never forget his answer. He turned to the rabbi and he said, Michael, it's not your problem. It's their
Mhm,
problem.
mhm,
And that's the mindset. When you get around that mindset, when you can recognize that it's not your problem, it's their problem, I speak truth. I want to quote Torah. I want to stick to the essence, and they have a problem with me about it. It's not my problem. It's their problem.
Mm, that's a good point. It's like the let them theory, just let
Yeah.
them be, and right.
No.
Wow, interesting. So you mentioned, the chief rabbinate, and you were a member of the board of the chief rabbinate for quite a long time. Is there a chance of you becoming a chief rabbi of England?
Um,
I
assuming
know I know years ago, the whole issue came up, and I'm just wondering if this is something that you considered or you would consider or you wanna be.
so that whole issue came up at the time when the chief rabbi Jonathan Sachs was then stepping down. It was at the early stages again of my father being unwell. In fact, it was probably in that same conversation. No, it was an earlier conversation I had with him when I came to visit him in Toronto. And I asked him, is it something I should consider ever trying to stand for? Besides the fact that they would never necessarily, or would they ever consider Chabad, etc., or non-British, whatever. And he said to me, the position today has become too politicized. It's not what it once was. It's not for you, quote unquote.
Mm,
What's amazing is I thought, okay, that's your opinion. But if ever you want an example of somebody speaking to you from the beyond, fast forward 2 years, and we're sitting Shiva for my father, and Rabbi Zalman Aaron Grossbaum, the head shliach of Toronto, comes into the Shiva and he sits down and he says, "You know that your father was very against you becoming chief rabbi." I was like, wow, wow, how do you know? And he says to me, because I asked him, no, so is your son going to become chief rabbi? And he said, I certainly hope not. I really don't want him to become chief rabbi. And so I got the message loud and clear. And I suppose
wow.
it should apply no less now than then.
So it's out of the question,
Kibbutz Av applies even when they're
right?
no longer in your physical midst. So,
100%. Wow. Okay.
but then again, we talked about never say never before.
Never
So
right.
gotta be careful.
Okay, interesting. I know there were a lot of very interesting stories of you with you and the Rebbe. Can you share some of them with us?
I suppose the most interesting story is the one that's most well known. And that is when I was a little boy of about 4 years old. So my parents had this custom at home where they would give us a bracha, a blessing every Friday night. The world as a whole has that custom in Chabad for whatever the reasons I do not know. We only do that on the eve of Yom Kippur. Nevertheless, my father saw it by his father-in-law, liked it, adopted it in our own home, and did so every Friday night. So my concept and my understanding of a blessing is exactly that: the hand on the head, and then the priestly blessing, Hashem should Yerecha, Hashem Yishmerecha, God should bless you, watch over you, etc. And
Do you
then,
do that with your children? Did you
well,
do that with your children?
let's find out. So
Okay.
I my parents told us that we were going to be going to New York and we're going to be going into Yechidus, into a private audience with the Rebbe. Um, that would have been, I think, perhaps my first one, and that the Rebbe is going to give us a bracha, the Rebbe is going to give us a blessing. And there we were in the Rebbe's room. It was just me and my older sister at the time, and my parents. And after the Yechidus, after the audience was finished, my mother starts to leave with my sister. I sit down on the floor in the Rebbe's room, and I start to cry. And the Rebbe became immediately very serious and looked to my father and said, "For was Veinter, why is he crying?" My father had no clue, absolutely no clue. But Bina Yasera, women are far more clued in. They are more in tune to everything that's going on. And my mother caught it in an instant, and she said to my father, he thinks he didn't get a blessing. Now, of course, I got a blessing from the Rebbe. The Rebbe would have given me a blessing in the standard that he gave everybody in different ways with different words. But the standard was orally to tell me that I should grow up to be a pious, God fearing, learned source of nachas to my parents, whatever. But to my mind, there's only one concept of a blessing: hand on the head, and then the priestly blessing, Yivarach Hashem Yishmerecha. So my father relayed this to the Rebbe. So then the Rebbe smiled, and the Rebbe said, "New customs in Chabad." And then the Rebbe added, and I didn't know this for years until I found it in my father's own handwriting, where he wrote down the story in the back of somewhere. The Rebbe said, but you probably don't care anyway. He said, "Mistama artemnish." That's what the Rebbe said. And then the Rebbe summoned me over off the floor to the side of his desk, called me over, and put his holy hand on my head and gave me the bracha of Yerachah Hashem v'Yishmerecha, etc., etc. And my father made a distinct point of reminding me of it the following Friday night and the Friday night after that, and the Friday night after that, and so too. Remember what happened in the Rebbe's room? Remember what happened?
Mm.
So it was etched, and it remains etched in my memory bank. So it's what we call Girsud Yankasa, experiences of childhood that become anchored and locked into your memory because, especially in that instance, so my father continuously brought it to the fore of my memory every single week to remind me for years afterwards. It's always the way he proceeded, giving me the blessing as he continued to do on Friday night. Now, if that's your end result of your father giving you a blessing, would I not want to continue that with my kids as well? So
Of
I
course.
do. I definitely
Right.
do. Yes, new custom in Chabad, but
Do
I
you
do.
do you rem do you remind your children that this is how you were blessed when you give them that blessing?
Well, I don't bring it up every time, but they don't like to go to sleep on Friday night without having first received the blessing.
Uh-huh.
My mother always did it, and when I'm home in Toronto, my mother still does it. Um, but my wife, it's not her custom. Fair enough. It wasn't ever anything that happened in her home, but I certainly still carry it on. 2 years later, I
Mm.
was in the Rebbe's room again for a private audience. This time, the Rebbe gave me a little black siddur, which I still have, of course, and use on special occasion. In which he told me, gave me my, because again, my father inscribed in the siddur what the Rebbe had said. The Rebbe pointed out that he was giving me a siddur and pointed out that there was a Tehillim in the siddur. Asked me if I knew what a Tehillim was. I take that as a cue of always making sure to put emphasis on Tehillim where it needs to be put. Um, and that was that Yechidus. I have letters from the Rebbe because my father always encouraged us to write for every birthday,
Mm.
every year, every single year. When once we were able to write, and it meant in the earlier years we would just copy. He would write it out in Hebrew lettering, and we would just copy it in our own handwriting, and then that would be sent to the Rebbe. And much more often than not, I got replies. I got a reply for my fifth birthday. I got a reply for my seventh, my ninth, my 10th. Then, of course, for
Like a
Bar
personal
Mitzvah.
re a personal
Personal
reply.
reply, yes. I
Mhm.
have those letters. Um, and then I guess the most recent experience, well, the two most recent experiences were again on the Shabbos of my Ufra, the Shabbos before I went to England to get married. I should add, when I was engaged, or just before I got engaged, my father was in New York, and I guess he shared my same anxieties about English mentality, as he actually sat there at the time, by his own admission, which I wouldn't have known, at the Farbrengen, in front of the Rebbe at the gathering there on the Shabbos, and it must have been on his mind because at a certain point the Rebbe turned to him and motioned him to say L'chaim, and then went like this to him, as though, and then he understood it. He told us afterwards that the Rebbe obviously saw that he was sitting there with certain perplexities, anxieties, my
Mm.
son marrying English, whatever, and that's what the Rebbe read, saw, told him, get rid of. Don't worry about it. On the Shabbos of my Ofra, the Shabbos before I got married, so the Rebbe called my father up again in the middle of the Farbrengen and gave him a bottle of vodka, of mashka, to take with to London for the occasion. And then the Rebbe asked, where's the chassan? And then, like a Mexican wave, I was carried all the way from my space all the way up to in front of the Rebbe. And the Rebbe poured into my cup and told me a binyan adayad and a bayis neman v'yisrael yisera Torah mitzvah. So that was a beautiful moment as well of getting that special bracha personally from the Rebbe at that point in time.
Beautiful, beautiful. It strikes me that the first encounter that you had was as that little boy being very obstinate and very stubborn, demanding that you get your own bracha, and maybe that has led you through life to be obstinate and stubborn with your own views and
Demand,
just
fair enough.
demanding what
Well observed. For me, the
well
bigger
observed.
lesson there is I should add, actually, in that story, as I've shared before, the Rebbe did tell my father afterwards not to publicize the story because he says, I
Interesting.
don't want other people to be jealous.
Ah,
And start asking for the same thing. So that story was never. I was a kid. I wasn't going to tell, but my father never shared the story outward for many, many, many years. It's come to something I knew, and I only started to share that story, I guess, much later on when I was in my late teens, 20s, whatever. There was no longer Yechidus then, anyway. Today, the story needs to be told for all kinds of other reasons because there are a lot of Jewish kids out there that are crying. And in that moment, imagine it was 11 o'clock at night, people waiting outside, Jewish child is crying for the Rebbe, the whole world stops to address the
mhm,
child. Why is the child crying? That's our ongoing mission statement as entrusted to us by the Rebbe.
hmm, beautiful. That is our statement. Wow. And in your function as a rabbi for so many years, what would you say is the greatest challenge that our generation has? I mean, this is what you're touching on this on one part of it in saying that this is a Joe's child crying and we have to reach out to him. What would you say over the years, has it changed? You've been a rabbi for over 30 years, many several decades. Has our challenge as a generation changed? What is our challenge?
I think it's fair to say that assimilation rates are up, that intermarriage rates tragically are up, and our ongoing challenge is probably no different than it always was, and that is to engage Jews at their level, to ensure to um, inspire them with just a little bit of spice and spirit of Yiddishkeit to reach through their hearts and touch their souls. Once upon a time, we did it in a more general sense or abstract way, stopping people in the street. You want to put on tefillin, you want to light Shabbos candles, and it was very limited. Today we do that through having Chabad on campus. Today we do that through C-teens. We're learning, and we have learned that we have to reach them at so many different levels long before they become grown adults, which was generally, apart from summer camps, our target group. Today the target group is right across the board, and we have to get them when they're so much younger, keep them engaged when they're teens, keep them engaged when they are uh, in university and campuses, keeps them engaged when there's now Chabad young professionals. So we've just broadened the same mission and broadened
Mhm.
it out to various different age ranges, literally right across the spectrum, because the challenge is great. I would say the challenge is no different. It's just far greater, and therefore the demand upon us is far greater in terms of being able to engage them at all the different levels.
Right, 100%. It's a big challenge. And what would you say personally for you is your greatest challenge? What do you find hardest?
My kids have a theory. Their theory is that what a person lectures most about, that's the thing that they struggle with most. Now,
Ah,
it's
interesting.
a loaded statement, and I said, "Okay, so how does that tie in with me?" And I said, "Well,
Right?
you love to lecture a lot about simcha, joy, happiness, the power of
Happiness.
positivity, the pursuit of happiness, etc." I said, "What? Are you suggesting that?" I remember we're sitting around the table. It's actually during COVID, so we're all around the table. I said, "Are you suggesting that I'm not a happy person?" And they all just burst out laughing. So to their mind, they think that that's maybe what I struggle with most, maybe worry, or things like that. I am currently writing a book on the subject during my current sabbatical, and yeah, I suppose internally maybe I there's always a certain, and I wouldn't say anxiety. Anxiety is something that everybody suffers from more so today than ever before. Was worrying something that was always embedded in me to one extent or another. Dare I confess this on something that's going to go out to a wider public? Possibly or probably so. It's
What
certainly,
why is that? Why is that that you were worried? What were you worried about, and what
I'm
what
not
worries
sure.
you now?
I don't know. I perhaps would say that I was brought up by a mother who was a Holocaust survivor, and
Mm,
it was certainly expressed in different ways through upbringing. She was one of the hidden children in Holland. It definitely affected her, and by her own admission. Um, and we are what you call second generation. So whatever
mm.
happens to them spills over to one extent or another to their kids. And that's not in any way a condemnation of any sorts of the way I was raised. But that
Mm.
worry factor was always there. I mean, I say that, but at the same time, my mother used to yell at me like nicely, sweetly about, where's your bitachon, where's your faith, come on, et cetera, et cetera. So she demonstrates incredible faith, my mother. She lived with incredible anxiety as a result of her war experiences. And I suppose that's something that, to one extent or another, I might find as a challenge. I don't find bitachon, I don't find faith as a challenge in any way, shape, or form. Um, it's funny, I was recently in conversation with a bishop and an imam to a Jewish group. It was an interesting, fascinating conversation. And the bishop, at a certain point, actually started to talk about his struggles with his faith and how sometimes he struggles with his belief in God. And me, true to my controversials, I couldn't help myself. I said, "Well, if that's really what you're dealing with, maybe you ought to hang up your cross." And the whole place just burst out laughing. I thought maybe I shouldn't have said that. Uh, but I don't struggle with faith, God forbid, in any way whatsoever. I have my father, my mother; they instilled that strongly into me. But the
But
paradox of
When you see, members of your congregation who are facing such tragedy and difficulty, I mean, you mentioned this helicopter accident or others, doesn't that, change your faith, or doesn't it affect your faith, or doesn't it rattle your faith, I guess I should say?
No, I dare say
No.
that, and I don't. That doesn't. I hope that doesn't sound cold. I was standing in Israel on Har Menuchas, the place where the mother and her two daughters were being laid to rest. And as the ambulances were coming in to bring them there was quite a large crowd. The father looked to me, and this is 10 o'clock at night, and he said to me, Rabbi, why does God allow for these things to happen?
Mhm,
And people, you're on a mountain, some people or somebody deal with it. So I didn't respond. So he did it again, and he did it louder. And this time a lot more people turned around. What am I going to answer him? I have something to say to him? I don't have an answer. And it would be presumptuous arrogance to even attempt to answer. I just walked over to him and I gave him a big hug and I held on to him while he cried and I cried and left it
mhm,
exactly at that. Um, we know that if I took God out of the equation, there wouldn't be the question of why, because there's nowhere to whom to direct that question in the first instance.
mm,
So my faith is very solid. My faith is exceptionally strong, and I have seen, unfortunately, in 30 plus years, a lot of adversity and different manifestation. It doesn't shake my faith. It upsets me. It makes me sometimes get upset with God, but that's
mhm,
okay. Elie Wiesel,
mhm,
I think, famously said it. He said, "You can either love God or you can be angry with God, but you can't ignore God." And
mm.
that's pretty much what sums it up. But that aside, worry is a different thing. So maybe I do worry. Maybe I have to admit
You
it
do
to my
worry.
kids. Maybe if they watch this, they're going to turn around and say, "Aha, you see, we told you. We know better than you."
Right, so the happiness, how are you gonna be working on that happiness? By writing your book?
When you
I
speak
think
things
when
out,
someone is, like, naturally happy, they don't know how to instruct other people to be happy, but when you're struggling with it, that's when you could lecture on it or write about it because you know how to it's not intuitive, it's not just natural, so you really have to struggle with how to teach it to somebody because you're grappling with it yourself.
there is this wonderful Yiddish expression, right? "Man sagt jenem, aber meint sich." You're talking to somebody else, but you really mean yourself.
Right, right, of
Often
course.
enough, when I have conversations with other people, I'm having a conversation with myself,
Right, right.
which, by the way, is the art of giving a great sermon.
Mhm. That's very true. Right. You wanna give us any other tips for a great sermon?
Wow. Okay. If we're on that topic, goodness. Um, I guess the most significant tip is, as somebody once said, make sure there's a very good beginning, make sure there's a very good end, make sure the distance between the two is very, very short.
Smart,
That's
right.
a very important tip.
Right.
I
Good
hear
tip.
about rabbis that talk for 40 minutes and like every Shabbos, oh, really? Yeah. And they think that everybody sitting there is really interested in that. I don't believe that for a second.
Right. Okay, on that note, I guess we'll make sure that the ending is not too far away for this interview. So I'll ask you the last question. I know you're on a sabbatical now. What are your hopes, dreams for the future? Any aspirations, ambitions that you wanna do or accomplish in this sabbatical or in the future in general?
The beauty of this sabbatical is that it actually provides me time to do things, and it shows you the vacuum that goes on in an otherwise busy rabbi's life. I'm actually sitting and learning.
Mhm,
Every single morning, I'm at shul at 7 o'clock, and I'm learning from 8 o'clock till 11 o'clock. It's amazing. It's like all of a sudden I'm back to learning two pages of Gemara every single day, several pages of Chassidus. I'm keeping very consistent to it, and then from 11 o'clock till about 4 o'clock, with a break for some exercise in between, I am sitting and writing the
mhm.
book on joy and the power of positivity.
Amazing. Beautiful. Rabbi Schochet, thank you so much for uh, being part of this interview and for sharing all that very interesting, insightful information with us. And we look forward to seeing your book.
Thank you.
Perhaps you'll do a lecture for us or a lecture series on this happiness.
God willing. Okay.
Wonderful.
Great to be
Okay.
with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Take
so
care.
much. Hatzlacha with everything. Success
Thank you.
with all your future endeavors.
And you as well. Keep up doing the incredible work that you do, the writing that you do, and the many different ways that you inspire so many people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed that interview with Rabbi Schochet. I guess I enjoyed it because he's also my cousin, so I got to hear a little about the behind the scenes of what's going on in his life, things that you don't usually get a chance to speak to a cousin who lives far away in England. I found it particularly interesting, the story that he explained with the Rebbe when he was such a young boy, that little crying boy, and how the Rebbe would not ignore that boy, and how he saw that as really his life's mission in going out there and helping, turning the tide against assimilation, turning the tide against, uh, you know, reaching out to children who are, whether they're spiritually children or emotionally children, or people who need that extra care, but just not ignoring the Jews around us, and reaching out and helping them and doing whatever we can to teach them Torah and to materially help them, and in any other way, which is really what his job is as a rabbi. I found his courage very interesting, how he doesn't mind standing up against the tide. Perhaps he did get that from those early years, standing up, being controversial when he needs to, that courage to be controversial, just letting people feel what they have, what they're saying, and not letting it be your problem, which I think is an important message for all of us, because so often we incorporate other people's opinions and feelings into ourselves. And he made it very clear, it's not a matter of when he's hurting somebody, of course, then he does care. But when it's a matter of just being true to his principles and other people have a problem with that, then it no longer becomes his problem. And I thought that was a really good and important message for all of us, for all times. I'm wondering what part you enjoyed from this interview. I thought it was really very interesting, a lot of different dimensions to his personality that we learned about. Growing up also in the shadows of a great, great father and what it's like. His father was, my uncle was just, Rabbi Emanuel Schochet was just an incredible person, brilliant, and growing up in his shadow, what it felt like as a boy, and how he felt like he needed to go to a different country, even a country like England, where he could spread his wings and become his own unique individual. If you enjoy watching these interviews, I hope you are subscribed to Chabad.org/extraordinary. We are on all podcast platforms. You can catch us there. Give us a comment. Tell us what you think. We'd love to hear from you. We love your feedback. We read every single one of them. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this extraordinary community.